Hello everyone, welcome back to Wuthering Heights. My name is Andrew. Make sure you subscribe to me and listen to the rest of Wuthering Heights. This is chapter 19. It's chapter 29. 29. So we've not got long to go, as you can see. About 50 pages or so. Chapter 29. The evening after the funeral, my young lady and I were seated in the library, now musing mournfully, one of us despairingly, on our loss, now venturing conjectures as to the gloomy future. We had just agreed the best destiny which could await Catherine would be a permission to continue residence at the Grange, at least, during Linton's life, he being allowed to join her there and I to remain as housekeeper. That seemed rather too favourable an arrangement to be hoped for, and yet I did hope, and began to cheer up under the prospect of retaining my home and my employment, and, above all, my beloved young mistress. When a servant, one of the discarded ones, not yet departed, rushed hastily in and said, "That devil Heathcliff was coming through the court. Should he fasten the door in his face?" If we had been mad enough to order that proceeding, we had not time. He made no ceremony of knocking or announcing his name. He was master, and availed himself of the master's privilege to walk straight in without saying a word. The sound of our informant's voice directed him to the library. He entered, and motioning him out, shut the door. It was the same room into which he had been ushered as a guest 18 years before. The same moon shone through the window, and the same autumn landscape lay outside. We had not yet lighted a candle, but all the apartment was visible, even to the portraits on the wall, the splendid head of Mrs. Linton and the graceful one of her husband. Heathcliff advanced to the hearth. Time had little altered his person either. There was the same man, his dark face rather sallower and more composed, his frame a stone or two heavier perhaps, with no other difference. Catherine had risen with an impulse to dash out when she saw him. "Stop," he said, arresting her by the arm. "No more running away. Where would you go? I've come to fetch you home, and I hope you'll be a dutiful daughter, and not encourage my son to further disobedience." I was embarrassed how to punish him when I discovered his part in the business. He's such a cobweb. A pinch would annihilate him. But you'll see by his look that he has received his due. I brought him down one evening, the day before yesterday, and sat him down in a chair and never touched him afterwards. I sent Hareton out, and we had the room to ourselves. In 2 hours, I called Joseph to carry him up again, and since then my presence is as potent on his nerves as a ghost, and I fancy he sees me often, though I am not near. Hareton says he wakes and shrieks in the night by the hour altogether, and then calls you to protect him from me, and whether you like your precious mate or not, you must come. He's your concern now. I yield all my interest in him to you. "Why not let Catherine continue to hear," I pleaded, "and send Master Linton to her? As you hate them both, you not miss them. They can only be a daily plague to your unnatural heart." "I'm seeking a tent for the Grange," he answered, "and I want my children about me. To be sure, besides, that lass owes me her services for her bread. I'm not going to nurture her in luxury and idleness after Linton is gone. Make haste and get ready now, and don't oblige me to compel you." "I shall," said Catherine. "Linton is all I have to love in the world, and though you have done what you could to make him hateful to me, and me to him, you cannot make us hate each other. I defy you to hurt him when I am by, and I defy you to frighten me." "Oh, you are a boastful champion," replied Heathcliff, "but I don't like you well enough to hurt him. You shall get the full benefit of the torment as long as it lasts. It is not I who will make him hateful to you, it is his own sweet spirit. He's as bitter as gall at your desertion and its consequences. Don't expect thanks for this noble devotion. I heard him draw a pleasant picture to Zillah of what he would do, as if he were as strong as I. The inclination is there, and his very weakness will sharpen its wits to find a substitute for strength." "I know he has a bad nature," said Catherine. "He's your son. But I'm glad I've a better to forgive it, and I know he loves me, and for that reason I love him. Mr. Heathcliff, you have nobody to love you, and however miserable you make us, we shall still have the revenge of thinking that your cruelty arises from your greater misery. You are miserable, are you not? lonely like the devil and envious like him. Nobody loves you. Nobody will cry for you when you die. I wouldn't be you." Catherine spoke with a kind of dreary triumph. She seemed to have made up her mind to enter into the spirit of her future family and draw pleasure from the griefs of her enemies. "You shall be sorry to be yourself presently," said her father-in-law. "If you stand there another minute, begone, witch, and get your things." She scornfully withdrew. In her absence, I began to beg for Zilla's place at the Heights, offering to resign mine, but he would suffer it on no account. He bid me be silent, and then for the first time allowed himself a glance around the room and a look at the pictures. Having studied Mrs. Linton, he said, "I shall have that home, not because I need it, but—" He turned abruptly to the fire, and continued with what, for lack of a better word, I must call a smile. "I'll tell you what I did yesterday. I got the sexton who was digging Linton's grave to remove the earth off her coffin lid, and I opened it. I thought once I would have stayed there when I saw her face again. It is hers yet. He had hard work to stir me, but he said it would change if the air blew on it, and so I struck one side of the coffin loose and covered it up. Not Linton's side, damn him. I wish he'd been soldered in lead, and I bribed the sexton to pull it away. When I'm laid there and slide mine out too, I'll have it made so, and then, by the time Linton gets to us, he'll not know which is which." "You are very wicked, Mr. Heathcliff," I exclaimed. "You are not ashamed to disturb the body?" "I disturb nobody, Nelly," he replied, and I gave some ease to myself. "I shall be a great deal more comfortable now, and you'll have a better chance of keeping me underground when I get there. Disturbed her? No, she has disturbed me night and day through 18 years, incessantly, remorselessly. Till yesternight I was tranquil. I dreamt I was sleeping the last sleep by that sleeper, with my heart stopped and my cheek frozen against hers. And if she had been dissolved into earth, or worse, what would you have dreamt of then?" I said. "Of dissolving with her, and being more happy still," he answered. "Do you suppose I dread any change of that sort? I expected such a transformation on raising the lid, but I'm better pleased that it should not commence till I share it. Besides, unless I had received a distinct impression of her passionless features, that strange feeling would hardly have been removed. It began oddly. I was wild after she died, and eternally from dawn to dawn praying her to return to me, her spirit. I have a strong faith in ghosts. I have a conviction that they can and do exist among us. The day she was buried, there came a fall of snow. In the evening I went to the churchyard. It blew bleak as winter, all round was solitary. I didn't feel that her fool of a husband would wander up to the den so late, and no one else had business to bring them there. Being alone and conscious 2 yards of loose earth was the sole barrier between us, I said to myself, I'll have her again in my arms. If she be cold, I'll think it is this north wind that chills me, and if she be motionless, it is sleep. I got a spade from the tool-house and began to delve with all my might. It scraped the coffin. I fell to work with my hands. The wood commenced cracking about the screws. I was on the point of attaining my object when it seemed that I heard a sigh from someone above, close at the edge of the grave, and bending down. If only I can get this off, I muttered. I wish they may shovel in the earth over both of us. And I wrenched more deeper, desperately still. There was another sigh at my ear. I appeared to feel the warm breath of it displacing the sleet-laden wind. I knew no living thing in flesh and blood was by, but as certainly as you perceive the approach to some substantial body in the dark, though it cannot be discerned, so certainly I felt that Cathy was there, not under me, but on the earth. A sudden sense of relief flowed from my heart through every limb. I relinquished my labour of agony and turned consoled at once, unspeakably consoled. Her presence was with me. It remained while I refilled the grave and led me home. You may laugh, if you will, but I was sure I should see her there. I was sure she was with me, and I could not help talking to her. Having reached the heights, I rushed eagerly to the door. It was fastened, and remember that accursed Earnshaw and my wife opposed my entrance. I remember stopping to kick the breath out of him, and then hurrying upstairs to my room and hers. I looked round impatiently. I felt her by me. I could almost see her, and yet I could not. I ought to have sweat blood then, from the anguish of my yearning, from the fervour of my supplications to have but one glimpse. I had not one. She showed herself, as she often was in life, a devil to me, and since then, sometimes more and sometimes less, I've been the sport of that intolerable torture, infernal, keeping my nerves at such a stretch that if they had not resembled catgut, they would long ago have relaxed to the feebleness of Linton's. When I sat in the house with Hareton, it seemed that on going out I should meet her. When I walked on the moors, I should meet her coming in. When I went from home, I hastened to return. She must be somewhere at the Heights, I was certain. And when I slept in her chamber, I was beaten out of that. I couldn't lie there. For the moment I closed my eyes, she was either outside the window or sliding back the panels or entering the room or even resting her darling head on the same pillow as she did when I was a child. And I must open my lids to see. And so I opened and closed them 100 times a night to be always disappointed. It racked me. I've often groaned aloud till that old rascal Joseph no doubt believed that my conscience was playing the fiend inside of me. Now, since I've seen her, I'm pacified a little. It was a strange way of killing, not by inches, but by fractions of hairbreadths, to beguile me with the spectre of a hope through 18 years. Mr. Heathcliff paused and wiped his forehead. His hair clung to it, wet with perspiration. His eyes were fixed on the red embers of the fire, the brows not contracted but raised next the temples, diminishing the grim aspect of his countenance, but imparting a peculiar look of trouble and a painful appearance of mental tension towards one absorbing subject. He only half addressed me, and I maintained silence. I didn't like to hear him talk. After a short period, he resumed his meditation on the picture, took it down, and leant it against the sofa to contemplate it at better advantage. And while so occupied, Catherine entered, announcing that she was ready with her pony when her pony should be saddled. "Send that over tomorrow," said Heathcliff to me. Then turning to her, he added, "You may do without your pony. It is a fine evening, and you'll need no ponies at Wuthering Heights. For what journeys you take, your own feet will serve you. Come along." "Goodbye, Ellen," whispered my dear little mistress, as she kissed me. Her lips felt like ice. "Come and see me, Ellen. Don't forget." "Take care you do no such thing, Mrs. Dean," said her new father. "When I wish to speak to you, I'll come here. I want none of your prying at my house." He signed her to precede him, and casting back a look that cut my heart, she obeyed. I watched them from the window, walk down the garden. Heathcliff fixed Catherine's arm under his, though she disputed the act at first, evidently, and with rapid strides he hurried her into the alley, whose trees concealed them. End of chapter 29. That's a pretty horrible chapter, wasn't it? Heathcliff digging down into the grave of Catherine. Oof. Oh. Ugh. No, thank you. Shall we have chapter 30? It's not a long one. I have paid a visit to the Heights, but I have not seen her since she left. Joseph held the door in his hand when I called to ask after her, and wouldn't let me pass. He said Mrs. Linton was thrang, and the master was not in. Zillah has told me something of the way they go on, otherwise I should hardly know who was dead and who was living. She thinks Catherine haughty, and does not like her. I can guess by her talk. My young lady asked some aid of her when she first came, but Mr. Heathcliff told her to follow her own business and let his daughter-in-law look after herself, and Zillah willingly acquiesced, being a narrow-minded, selfish woman. Catherine, evinced a child's annoyance at this neglect, repaid it with contempt, and thus enlisted my informant among her enemies, as securely as if she had done her some great wrong. I had a long talk with Zillah about 6 weeks ago, a little before you came one day, when we foregathered on the moor, and this is what she told me. "The first thing Mrs. Linton did," she said, "on her arrival at the Heights was to run upstairs without even wishing good evening to me and Joseph. She shut herself into Linton's room and remained till morning. Then, while the master and Earnshaw were at breakfast, she entered the house and asked all in a quiver if the doctor might be sent for. Her cousin was very ill." "We know that," answered Heathcliff, "but his life is not worth a farthing, and I won't spend a farthing on him." "But I cannot tell how to do," she said, "and if nobody will help me, he'll die." "Walk out of the room," cried the master, "and let me never hear a word more about him." None here care what becomes of him. If you do, act the nurse. If you do not, lock him up and leave him. Then she began to bother me, and I said I'd had enough plague with the tiresome thing. We each had our tasks, and hers was to wait on Linton. Mr. Heathcliff bid me leave that labour to her. How they managed together I can't tell. I fancy he fretted a great deal, and moaned her Selin night and day, and she had precious little rest. One could guess by her white face and heavy eyes. She sometimes came into the kitchen all wildered-like, and looked as if she would fain beg assistance. But I was not going to disobey the master. I never dare disobey him, Mrs. Dean, and though I thought it wrong that Kenneth should not be sent for, it was no concern of mine, either to advise or complain, and I always refused to meddle. Once or twice, after we'd gone to bed, I've happened to open my door again and seen her sitting crying on the stairs top, and then I've shut myself in quick for fear of being moved to interfere. I did pity her then, I'm sure. Still, I don't want to lose my place, you know. At last one night she came boldly into my chamber and frightened me out of my wits by saying, "Tell Mr. Heathcliff that his son is dying." "I'm sure he is, this time. Get up instantly and tell him." Having uttered this speech, she vanished again. I lay a quarter of an hour listening and trembling. Nothing stirred. The house was quiet. She's mistaken, I said to myself. He's got over it. I needn't disturb them. And I began to doze. But my sleep was marred a second time by a sharp ringing of the bell, the only bell we have, put up on purpose for Linton, and the master called me to see what was the matter and informed them that he wouldn't have that noise repeated. I delivered Catherine's message. He cursed to himself, and in a few minutes came out with a lighted candle and proceeded to their room. I followed. Mrs. Heathcliff was seated by the table, with her hands folded on her knees. Her father-in-law went up, held the light to Linton's face, looked at him, and touched him afterwards. He turned to her. "Now, Catherine," he said, "how do you feel?" She was dumb. "How do you feel, Catherine?" he repeated. "He's safe, and I'm free," she answered. I should feel well, but," she continued with a bitterness she couldn't conceal, "you have left me so long to struggle against death alone that I feel and see only death. I feel like death." And she looked it too. I gave her a little wine. Hareton and Joseph, who had been wakened by the ringing and the sound of feet and heard our talk from outside, now entered. Joseph was fain, I believe, of the lad's removal. Hareton seemed a thought bothered, though he was more taken up with staring at Catherine than thinking of Linton. But the master bid him get off to bed again. We didn't want his help. He afterwards made Joseph remove the body to his chamber and told me to return to mine, and Mrs. Heathcliff remained by herself. In the morning, he sent me to tell her she must come down to breakfast. She had undressed and appeared going to sleep, and said she was ill, at which point I hardly wondered. I informed Mr. Heathcliff, and he replied, "Well, let her be till after the funeral. Go up now, and then get her what is needful, and as soon as she seems better, tell me." Cathy stayed upstairs a fortnight, according to Zillah, who visited her twice a day, and would have been rather more friendly, but her attempts at increasing kindness were proudly and promptly repelled. Heathcliff went up at once to show her Linton's will. He had bequeathed the whole of his and what had been her movable property to his father. The poor creature was threatened or coaxed into the act during her week's absence when his uncle died. The lands, being a minor, he could not meddle with. However, Mr. Heathcliff has claimed and kept them in his wife's right, and also his, I suppose legally at any rate. Catherine, destitute of cash and friends, cannot disturb his possession. "Nobody," said Zillah, "ever approached her door, except that once, and nobody asked anything about her. The first occasion of her coming down into the house was on a Sunday afternoon. She had cried out, when I carried her up dinner, that she couldn't bear any longer being in the cold, and I told her the master was going to Thrushcross Grange, and Earnshaw, and I needn't hinder her from descending. So, as soon as she heard Heathcliff's horse trot off, she made her appearance, donned in black, and her yellow curls combed back behind her ears, as plain as a Quaker. She couldn't comb them out. Joseph and I generally go to chapel on Sundays. The kirk, has no minister now," explained Mrs. Dean, "and they call the Methodists' or Baptists' place, I can't say which it is, at Gimmerton, a chapel." Joseph had gone, she continued, but I thought proper to bide at home. Young folks are always the better for an elder's overlooking, and Hareton, with all his bashfulness, isn't a model of nice behaviour. I let him know that his cousin would very likely sit with us, and she had been always used to see the Sabbath respected, so he had as good leave his guns and bits of indoor work alone while she stayed. He coloured up at the news and cast his eyes over the hands and clothes. The train oil and gunpowder were shoved out of sight in a minute. I saw he meant to give her his company, and I guessed by his way he wanted to be presentable. So, laughing, as I durst not laugh in the master I offered to help him, if he would, and joked at his confusion. He grew sullen and began to swear. "Now, Mrs. Dean," she went on, seeing me not pleased by her manner, "you happen to think your young lady too fine for Mr. Hareton, and happen you're right. But I own I should love well to bring her pride a peg lower. And what will all her learning and daintiness do for her now? She's as poor as you or I. Poorer, I'll be bound you're saving, and I'm doing my little that road." Hareton allowed Zillah to give him her aid. Hareton allowed Zillah to give him her aid, and she flattered him into a good humour. So when Catherine came, half forgetting her former insults, he tried to make himself agreeable by the housekeeper's account. Another little sip. Mrs. walked in, she said, as chill as an icicle and as high as a princess. I got up and offered her my seat in the armchair. No, she turned her nose up at my civility. Earnshaw rose too and bid her come to the settle and sit close by the fire. He was sure she was starved. "I've been starved a month and more," she answered, resting on the word as scornful as she could. And she got a chair for herself and placed it at a distance from the both of us. Having sat till she was warm, she began to look round and discovered a number of books in the dresser. She was instantly up on her feet again, stretching to reach them, but they were too high up. Her cousin, after watching her endeavours a while, at last summoned courage to help her. She held her frock, and he filled it with the first that came to hand. That was a great advance to the lad. She didn't thank him. Still, he felt gratified that she had accepted his assistance, and ventured to stand behind as she examined them, and even to stoop and point out what struck his fancy in certain old pictures which they contained. Nor was he daunted by the saucy style in which she jerked the page from his finger. He contented himself with going a bit further back and looking at her instead of the book. She continued reading, or seeking for something to read. His attention became by degrees quite centred in the study of her thick, silky curls. Her face he couldn't see, and she couldn't see him, and perhaps not quite awake to what he did, but attracted like a child to a candle, at last he proceeded from staring to touching. He put out his hand and stroked one curl, as gently as if it were a bird. He might have stuck a knife into her neck. She started round in such a taking. "Get away this moment! How dare you touch me? Why are you stopping there?" she cried in a tone of disgust. "I can't endure you. I'll go upstairs again if you come near me." Mr. Hareton recoiled, looking as foolish as he could do. He sat down in the settle, very quiet, and she continued turning over volumes another half hour. Finally, Earnshaw crossed over and whispered to me, "Will you ask her to read us, Zillah? I'm stalled of doing naught, and I could like to hear her. Dunnot say wanted it, but ask if yourself." "Mr. Hareton wishes you would read to us, ma'am," I said immediately. "He'd take it very kind. He'd be much obliged." She frowned, and looking up answered, "Mr. Hareton and the whole set of you will be good enough to understand that I reject any pretence at kindness you have the hypocrisy to offer. I despise you, and will have nothing to say to any of you. When I would have given my life for one kind word, even to see one of your faces, you all kept off. But I won't complain to you. I'm driven down here by the cold, not to amuse you or enjoy your society." "What could I have done?" began Earnshaw. "How was I to blame?" "Oh, you're an exception," answered Mrs. Heathcliff. "I never missed a concern for as you." "But I offered more than once, and asked," he said, kindling up at her pertness. "I asked Mr. Heathcliff to let me wake for you." "Be silent! I'll go out of doors or anywhere rather than have your disagreeable voice in my ear," said my lady. Hareton muttered, "She might go to hell for him," and unslinging his gun restrained himself from his Sunday occupations no longer. He talked now freely enough, and she presently saw fit to retreat in her solitude. But the frost had set in, and in spite of her pride, she was forced to consent to our company more and more. However, I took care that there should be no further scorning at my good nature. Ever since, I've been as stiff as herself, and she has no lover or liker among us. She does not deserve one, for let them say the least word to her, and she'll curl back without respect of anyone. She'll snap at the master himself, and as good as dares him to thrash her, and the more hurt she gets, the more venomous she grows. At first, on hearing this account from Zillah, I determined to leave my situation, take a cottage, and get Catherine to come and live with me. But Mr. Heathcliff would as soon permit that as he would set up Hareton in an independent house, and I can see no remedy at present unless you can marry again, and that scheme it does not come within my providence to arrange. Thus ended Mrs. Dean's story. Notwithstanding the doctor's prophecy, I am rapidly recovering strength, and though it be only the second week in January, I propose getting on horseback in a day or two and riding over to Wuthering Heights, to inform my landlord that I shall spend the next 6 months in London, and if he likes, he may look out for another tenant to take the place after October. I would not pass another winter here for much. End of chapter 30. Well, I don't think I can blame Catherine for acting much like that, can you? So we're caught up now with the beginning of the story. Mrs. Dean has told us everything that's happened up to this point, and now we're back where we started, essentially. So we'll see what happens in the remaining 2 or 3 chapters. 3 chapters to go. Well, join me for the next reading in a few days, I guess. See you then. Don't forget to follow me. Tap on my face down there, somewhere down there, and make sure you tap onto the bell as well to make sure you get a notification when I next read, or indeed go live with Silas Marner. I'll see you next time, everybody. Bye-bye.